Look, we are going to talk about Stranger Things. Part 1 of Season 5 just came out.
Yeah, what could go wrong?
No idea, but I think we should find out.
Before we get into this conversation, because Alison, Herman didn't necessarily love it, Hoai-Tran had these high expectations for the season. A lot to talk about there, but the thing that got me is that we all really reacted to the fact that these kids are not in high school. It is hard to buy that they are still in high school.
Everyone in? I want to see Vecna's heart on a platter.
And honestly, like, I'm someone who loves the show, and the show's been around for 10 years at this point. But it is a little bit difficult to sort of go, okay, let me suspend my disbelief and just get into the final season of the show that I love, of these kids who are clearly not in high school anymore. We struggle with it. I'm not gonna lie to you. I don't know if you struggle with it too, but I'm excited for you to hear this conversation. Let's get right into it. I'm going to miss it. I don't know about you guys, but I am genuinely going to miss that creepy little introduction, because it is now the beginning of the end of Stranger Things, the Netflix show. It is one of the biggest shows of all time. It's one of the biggest shows of the last 10 years. Certainly, the first few episodes of the show's 5th season just dropped on Netflix. Alison, Herman has seen it. Hoai-Tran has seen it. They have some thoughts, and they are here. Hello, friends. How's it going?
Going good, thanks.
Nice to have you here. Look, before we get into this new season, before we get into the fact that it crashed Netflix momentarily when the first episodes actually dropped, I want to sort of start us off at a simpler time and maybe a nicer time. We're going to go back to 2016 for a moment, if you don't mind. Stranger Things quietly comes out on Netflix, right? Not a lot of advertising, not a lot of fanfare. And then what you get is this little clip that sort of reminds us of where it all began.
Protect it was an anger! And fireball!
Look, there was an innocence to it, right? Like the thing that we just saw there, that we saw Mike and Will and Lucas and Dustin, they're just playing Dungeons and Dragons, and there's something about that gripped people. It just landed really strongly. Alison, I want to start with you. Were you surprised at how big this show got?
I think everyone involved with the show was surprised. And if they say they weren't, they're lying. I think something that's hard to remember looking back to 2016 is that Netflix is not what it became. And therefore, the scale of the things that truly pop on that platform was almost impossible to comprehend. And now we're in this moment where we understand that Netflix is so huge that some things get lost. But when things really tap into the algorithm, that's 300 million subscribers across the globe, which just dwarfs, even Friends in its heyday was not getting those numbers like immediately. And so I think what we've witnessed is the tandem rise of not just this television show, but this entire way of consuming and distributing TV that just didn't exist previously.
Certainly you could tell that like Netflix had to reconfigure its own understanding of what counts as a hit because of the show. I mean, like literally all seasons of the show right now are in the top 10 of most watched things on Netflix. And there's something sort of that has longevity about that. Hoai-Tran, I want to ask you about this because there's no denying the popularity of the show today. But what is it, you think, about Stranger Things that just kind of made it this obvious cultural phenomenon now that we're looking at it?
Well, not to use too much industry speak, but it was a 4-quadrant hit. It was a hit with adults, it was hit with teens, it was hit with men, women. I remember it was advertised as the Winona Ryder horror series, so that 80s nostalgia definitely played a part in making it known. But it was a phenomenon because it was just this cross-generational success. There's something so universally appealing about a story about kids on bikes, making their own way through this small town. And that brought in, like the younger generation, while the 80s nostalgia obviously kept the older generation invested. I think that's what kept the show so relevant and introduced younger kids to 80s cultural touchstones and end up kind of reviving them in pop culture.
And I think like those touchstones feel so familiar. That's like there's something actually deeply comforting about watching Stranger Things, because I watch it and go, I know what that is. That feels familiar to me, even if the story is trying to take us somewhere different. But now we are a decade later, and the cast is a decade older, and the world is slightly different than, the world that the show first came out in. Alison, briefly talk to me about the focus of the first few episodes of this final season. Where are things for the people of Hawkins? What's happening?
Sure. So we open a full 18 months after the events of season 4, which is clearly at least a little bit of an attempt to address the very obvious and visible aging of the certain members of the cast.
Millie Bobby Brown is a
And
mother now. You know what I mean? Like we have moved. They are older. They have grown. But yes, continue. Yes.
yes, there are potential college graduates playing 15-year-olds now, and it shows. And
Yes.
they sort of walk back. The climactic event of season 4 is that Vecna, the ultimate villain, has pierced the boundary between this dimension known as the Upside Down and the real world. And when we open, Hawkins is not suddenly crawling with creepy vines, but the town has been placed under military quarantine.
Yeah.
And the characters are trying to figure out where Vecna has gone, because after being critically injured in the season 4 finale, he sort of disappeared and he's lying low. And we get a lot of scenes fully within the Upside Down because the military has constructed a base there that is led by Dr. K, who's played by, in another example of 80s nostalgia casting, Linda Hamilton.
Right.
And that's sort of where we start.
Yeah, so the idea of like moving the clock 18 months later and just saying, okay, here's where we are now. There's something about this that is actually like, before we even get there, the show also wants to root you a little bit in the nostalgia of the first season. So they do a little bit of a callback. You get the scene of being like, this is what happened when Will went missing in the Upside Down. But why do you think the Duffer Brothers wanted to start there, Alison? Why did that seem important to sort of go like, before we get to now, you should also just remember what he was like. And also we de-aged Will, even though that's a strange thing to do and it's very uncomfortable to watch on television.
Yeah, you really see that like de-aging, a 60-year-old to look 30 is not really the same as de-aging a 21-year-old to look 10.
At all. Very unsettling, but yes.
Yes, but I think what's clearly happening is that the Duffer Brothers, Matt and Ross, are really trying to reiterate that we are landing the plane, we are heading towards the finale, and we are trying to do as much as we can to make this into a cohesive story. And so a lot of what you've seen with the introduction of Vecna in the last couple seasons has been, we're introducing a unifying figure who has been there since the beginning. That's what that prologue is supposed to tell you, and will be there until the end. And that is kind of the one story task we need to accomplish in order to feel like we've reached a satisfying conclusion.
Hoai-Tran, I am the Tyra meme of we were all rooting for you. That is who I am when I start to watch Stranger Things. I've watched the first episode. I've not watched the other 3, but you've watched the first 4. Hit me with your reaction to this new season. How are you feeling about it?
So I was actually really anticipating this new season because I thought season 4 was a huge return to form for the show. And I was really emotionally invested in the characters again. And I was excited to see how they're going to wrap things up. But as I started to watch the new episodes, my excitement slowly fell to disappointment.
Your whole face just fell just now. You're like,
Yeah, I was like, oh no. I think that what worked for season 4 kind of became the albatross around the show's neck, and that season 5 tries to repeat a lot of those successful beats to much lesser effect. And then I think that the pacing is really off with this entire season. Try not to be too hard on it, like Alison hasn't already given it a beating, but I think that this, after watching the 4 episodes, they really could have condensed it to like 2 episodes, because there's just so much, just like they try to like have like add more like additional character banter and bickering that kind of ends up dragging. The pacing, I think, is a little bit all over the place. And there are some really fun moments, and it's exciting to see all these characters again, but I do think that they could have just condensed it a lot, and I think that's the biggest failing of the new episodes.
Yeah, the problem is that like they have a lot of storylines to wrap up, and then they're also adding all this exposition that is not wrapping up any kind of storyline. And I say this again with love, as someone who's like rooting genuinely for the show. As you watch these episodes, are there characters, or are there storylines where you're like, you know what, I'm invested still in this. I still want to see what happens with this. Hoai-Tran.
I want to see what happens with Max. Like season 4, I'm kind of like holding it up as like this big like paragon, because I was really like back in for it. And I think that she had the greatest arc out of season 4. Like her, running up that hill, Kate Bush moment became such a like really kind of an all-time great TV moment, I want to say. Like it might seem cheesy to say, but it was like just a really fantastic
It brought Kate
bit of
Bush back into
television.
the zeitgeist like fully because of that
Exactly. And
moment. Yeah.
it was so emotionally just moving.
Yeah.
I was invested in her arc and her character, and I felt like she was one of the last characters in sort of the main ensemble to retain a real like thorniness and depth. I feel like everyone's like in the ensemble have kind of been shaved down a little bit. Like
Hmm.
everyone's been it's a little bit they're a little too nice now. And I feel
Hmm.
like Max still kind of has a little bit of that just like bitterness that I really liked in like the early characters. Like, Jonathan was kind of a stalker in the first season. And you're like,
Yeah. Yeah.
and Steve was an asshole, and I kind of miss a little bit of that humanity
Bit of
that
attention.
came
Yeah.
with those flaws. Exactly.
Yeah, totally agreed. Alison, I want to ask you the same question, but keep it in mind that like your review, I loved your review of the show, but you also like highlighted
Thank
the
you.
distance between what the show has always wanted to be and where the show kind of ended up in this sort of final season, at least what we have of it so far. And you went all in on those shortcomings. But I also want to ask you, having said that, are there storylines where you're like, I'm still invested in this. I still want to see how this plays out because they still haven't released the final 4 episodes of the show.
Well, I think bringing up Max is a great point because my principal objection to the show as it's ballooned into this worldwide phenomenon is
Yeah.
that when it started, it was fundamentally a show about childhood,
Yeah.
about how it feels to be a young person who's totally overwhelmed by the scary unknown and, to pit yourself against the adult world and the simplicity and the naivete. And it has not evolved along with the cast into adulthood. And I think Max is an exception in that, given everything that happened with her brother, like that character is in a much darker place. She has more complexity. I think the sort of metaphor of Vecna coming for her really captured something about the onset of adolescence. And they haven't really done that with a lot of the other characters. And in fact, there's this very obvious thing the Duffers do where they basically swap in a fresh set of 11-year-olds where Holly, the youngest Wheeler child, and Derek, who's kind of the comic relief of the season, are basically just like put in to be like, okay, well, we need new people to play this role. And I think the exceptions to that, along with Max, I think some of the things that they're doing with Will and his discovering his sexuality, and there's a bond that strikes up between him and Robin, the character played by Maya Hawke, over being queer people in 1980s Indiana,
Yeah.
a place that was not easy for them. And I think that's an interesting example of the show actually accepting like these characters are older, we need to evolve along with them into something that's like a little grittier and a little more complex. And I don't think the show should turn into The Sopranos, but I wish it evolved a little more, and I like the fragments of the show that give glimpses of what that version could be.
I take that point seriously. This idea that if you make a show about childhood, then you should sort of continue to follow that through line, or at least overcome the production challenges that make it, just extend over 10 years that you're making the show, because you are in fact going to lose some of the key aspects of those childhoods that you're sort of maybe trying to reflect on. And so the show feels entirely different than it did when we first sort of fell in love with it. And I think we did fall in love with it. This show from the very beginning is a tribute to childhood, but also a tribute to something else, which is, I think, like doing 80s nostalgia justice. And by saying the way that 80s sci-fi and horror sort of approached childhood, but did something special, or at least like some of those films really brought us closer to something beautiful about humanity. The Duffer Brothers have talked a lot about their influences. Like they've talked about Spielberg, they've talked about Stephen King, they talked about John Carpenter. There is the criticism, Alison, that Stranger Things relies a little bit too much on nostalgia, and it's not actually like creating its own separate footprint. Does that criticism hold up to you? Do you kind of feel like you're like, this is a lot of rewarming, of stuff that's already been done, or do you kind of feel like they've kind of cast their own lane when it comes to nostalgia?
Yeah, I think to sort of use the metaphor of the kids on bikes, I think using the liberal references to things like E.T. and Stand By Me and those really classic works, they're almost like training wheels, right? It's a shortcut to
Yes, it
tell
is.
the audience,
Yeah.
this is what we're doing, this is who we are. And to the Duffers' credit, like saying you want to evoke something is not the same as successfully conjuring that feeling. And they absolutely did that for the first few seasons of this show.
Yeah.
And I think the problem is that once the training wheels come off, you need to develop things that are really distinctly your own. And I think it's sort of interesting to compare the world building of this show to something like Game of Thrones or Severance or other like sci-fi and fantasy shows that have gotten big on a comparable scale. And Game of Thrones obviously has like an absurd amount of detailed lore. I think Severance is a little more, they start throwing more stuff in the second season, as we saw, that I thought was really interesting. And I think the world building on this show has always reflected the simplicity of that initial setup of like calling the dimension the Upside Down and naming the monsters after Dungeons and Dragons.
There's an innocence to that, right? Like, there's an innocence to that that's, I think, well captured anyway.
And in this season, they again do the same thing by swapping Holly in, where they're like, okay, her lens is A Wrinkle in Time, and so we're going to introduce this character of Mr. Whatsit. Yeah. And again, with the cast growing up, I feel like there hasn't been an attendant richness, at least in the text of the show. And that's where I think the criticism of over-reliance on nostalgia really comes in.
Hoai-Tran, I'll give you the last word on this. I think like the Duffer Brothers have to land this plane. They have to land this plane with part 2 of season 5, which comes out, I think, New Year's Eve. And so we are now at a place of saying, okay, you don't have a lot to go here. You don't have a lot of room to go here. And this last bit has got to do a lot of things. How do you think they approach sort of wrapping up all these things? What do they need to do to maybe try to hit the mark, or at least like leave it on some kind of high note?
At this point, I think Stranger Things has so much embraced the sort of blockbuster element that they just need to go all out with the spectacle. And I do think that after a lot of wheel spinning in these first 4 episodes, they reach that point in the final episode. And I'm like, finally, I want to see some things blow up, I guess. And honestly, I'm fine with that. Like, there's nothing really wrong with being like, okay, you're reaching the finale. I want to see the spectacle. I want to see it go big. And I think that's fine for Stranger Things to just really embrace. And so yeah, I hope to see like, the big battle. And I think that it's fine if they embrace that aspect of themselves, because that's what they are now at this point.
I'll tell you this, I am often surprised by how often I forgive everything if there's a very good big battle. Like I was like, we were a little bit choppy getting there, but then we get to the big battle and you totally earned your keep. So I'm also holding out hope, but also from what I'm hearing from both of you, maybe I should be a little bit judicious about how I dole out that hope. I got to leave it there. I appreciate your time. You guys are wonderful. Thank you so much for coming on the show today.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you. Alison Herman writes for Variety. Hoai-Tran Bui is an entertainment editor at Inverse. Stranger Things Season 5, Volume 1 is out now on Netflix. Volume 2 drops, Christmas Day. And the finale comes out on New Year's Eve. My name is Elamin Abdelmahmoud. This show is called Commotion. Hey, we'll see you tomorrow.